Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, only 3% of tenure-track faculty in the United States are Latino. The numbers of tenured and tenure-track Latino faculty at elite institutions is even smaller. This despite the fact that Latinos comprise nearly 19% of the population and are the fastest growing ethnicity here in the United States. Afro Latina professor and scholar of Latinx studies, Lorgia Garcia-Peña served on the faculty of Harvard University from 2013 to 2021. She's written a book about her experience, Community as Rebellion, a syllabus for surviving academia as a woman of color. And she joins us now. Professor Garcia-Peña, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
Can you help our viewers understand what tenure is and how it's used by institutions to convey who is and who is not valuable in the institution?
Tenure is a system that's quite unique to academia. It is meant, or it was created to protect academic freedom. That is, to protect faculty, researchers, scholars who criticize, let's say, the government or corporations. And what it means is that you have your job for life. You cannot be fired in most cases, unless there's something illegal that you've done or whatnot. In reality, the way tenure operates in our contemporary institutions is a reward system that quite a few of faculty are allowed to sort of enter into the what is known as the tenure track. The majority of the teaching staff is not welcome into the tenure track. So it's a reward system that has been for a while, kind of creating almost a caste system within the teaching staff and in our institutions of learning.
Now, I've read the tenure committee had unanimously recommended your promotion. A second hire committee also endorsed the recommendation, but then you were denied tenure at Harvard in 2019. Can we talk a little bit about that experience and how you ultimately arrived at a place where you can describe it simultaneously as violent and edifying?
It was a very difficult experience because I had spent about 8 years working in an institution in which I had given a lot of myself to building, particularly within my field of knowledge, which is ethnic studies. So it felt like a bucket of ice water in your face. You've spent all this time, you've been giving all of these messages. I had done everything right, and even though I had always doubted the institution, it was still painful. But I held on to two things: the community that I had co-created with students and scholars across the country and outside the country, across the globe, really, that sustained me, that supported my work, that read me, that saw me, and the work that I had been doing with my research. And it was really that which saved me. I was very clear from the beginning that my work wanted to do in the world was being done, and that I did not need to be sanctioned by an institution in order to do that work. So while it was a painful experience, while it was a violent experience, it really didn't stop me. I was able to continue working, to continue writing, to continue teaching, with the knowledge and the understanding that I wasn't alone, that I was part of a sum rather than just one person. That really is what allowed me to do the work and to write this book that I've written.
Right. Now, I want to dig into the book in a few minutes, but I also read that during your time at Harvard, so the tenure, sort of the experience of sort of going through the tenure process was one thing, but you often found that the simple act of teaching class subjected you and at times your students to scrutiny and surveillance by campus police. So there seems like an added layer of stress. Can you speak to that?
So the thing about being a woman of color in an elite academic institution is that you're inhabiting a space that was not created for you. That was not created for you in the sense that if we think about the fact that most elite institutions in the United States were built to educate the sons of colonizers,
Hmm.
and that the knowledge that was being taught was not coming from the same experiences and histories that my communities come from. And so
Hmm.
existing in those spaces, you always disrupt. You always stand up or stand out rather.
Hmm.
So my experience navigating institutions such as Harvard were always in many ways experiences of violence, where the way in which I lived through, the way in which I walked through the halls of the university
Hmm.
felt different than it did for my colleagues. And I was acutely aware of that. And there were moments every day in which that was really clear. Things like coming into the building where I had my office for several years and having the security personnel asking me to show ID when right
Hmm.
next to me they wouldn't ask my white colleagues to show ID,
Yeah.
or taking my students into the yard, which is a very sort of American scene. You know, if you talk to people outside of the United States about what an American university looks like, they look at the green and students sitting on the green and reading poetry. And when I
Yeah.
attempted to do things like that with my students, a very normal experience, especially in spring, especially when you're teaching in areas like I was in Boston, where it's cold. The moment it gets warm, you want to take a class outside. Every time
Yeah.
I tried to do that, someone would call the campus police on us
Hmm.
because we were literally existing in that space that we didn't seem to belong, or we're
Hmm.
not belonging. So it was violent. It was constant. It was
Yeah.
relentless.
Yeah.
Um, what I and my students have gone through and continue to go through in these spaces. And it's what's sad is that this is not unique.
Yeah.
My experience in the academy, it's not unique.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's
Absolutely.
shared.
Yeah, it's shared, and it's a shared shame, quite frankly. You know what? I did reach out to Harvard University Police Department for comments on what their policy is on harassment for faculty, related to faculty, students, and staff. Their comment, quote, "Thank you for reaching out. The university does not have a comment to provide on this." Now, you've mentioned that you've done a lot of work supporting the undocumented, the DACA students. I wonder if you could sort of expand a little bit upon the research you have done around that area, in that area.
Most of the work that I've done in support of undocumented students has been in terms of social justice and activism. So when I was first hired at the University of Georgia as an assistant professor of Latinx studies, the Board of Regents of the University of the Georgia University systems banned undocumented students from accessing public institution. This is in 2011. And for those of you who don't know, undocumented students in the United States have always had a hard time accessing higher educations, mainly because of funding, right? They're not eligible for financial aid. But this took things to a different level, right?
Mm,
This meant that even if you had a scholarship, even if you had a rich donor saying, I'm going to pay for a college, even if you saved up, you were
mm,
not allowed to
hmm,
register in the university. So one of the things that I did along with amazing colleagues at the University of Georgia was to co-create a school for undocumented students. We call it Freedom University, which is
mm,
still running in Atlanta, Georgia. And it became a national model for supporting undocumented and other minoritized and excluded communities across the United States. And so a lot of the work that I've done around that community has been not so much in terms of the research I do, but mostly in terms of practical work to support students in institutions and outside of institutions. So working with campus, working with administration to make sure that resources are in place,
yeah,
things like DACA renewal fees, having access to mental health support,
yeah,
and legal support if you are undocumented students on campus, right? So a lot of schools around, particularly after the passage of DACA, schools
Yeah.
allowed students to come in and would fund them, but then once they arrived, we're done, right?
Yeah.
and and so the resources were not in place, and so a lot of the work that I've been doing is advocating for undocumented students and to make sure that our schools, that our universities have basic resources to support them as they go through their college and graduate school uh, time on campus.
Now, as you're saying this, I wonder, are institutions of learning a microcosm of an oppressive nation state? Do universities create forms of inclusion and exclusion? Yes, in the teaching space, certainly the faculty space. How do we exist, you think, in these types of institutions?
Universities are absolutely microcosms of what we see in the nation and what we see in the world. There are borders that cannot be crossed by certain people.
Hmm.
There are levels of access. There are forms of exclusion. But what makes it, for me, in my appreciation, most violent and scary is that universities present themselves as benevolent institutions. And so
Mhm.
while we are used to criticizing the state, criticizing corporations,
Yeah.
sort of confronting in places that are inherently violent, that we see as sites of racial capitalism, we are
Mhm.
not accustomed to seeing universities as those kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
All the opposite. We are accustomed to understanding the university as the spaces of freedom, where of learning, as a
Yeah.
space where racism doesn't transpire,
Yeah.
where we're aspiring to something better. And then when you to that you add the narrative of inclusion,
Yeah.
racial justice, and now belonging that is in most missions of all these institutions. And so it gives the appearance of being something different. And so I
Yeah.
think it's time that we start to look at the university for what it is, which
Yeah.
is very much so a colonizing and colonial institution that continues to reproduce the same kinds of exclusions and
Hmm.
violence that we see in the nation state.
Like any good book, any good syllabus, the book opens with some requirements, course requirements. You framed it. What one needs to for learning, understanding the academy, basically. So the course requirements are therefore an open heart, a flexible mind, the desire to be part of the sum rather than a single part, and patience. Stuff I'd never heard. I never heard this type of advice. Just never came to me. Um, let's talk a little bit about you know why these particular qualities become really important for succeeding in the academy.
I mean, the main thing I would say is that we also need to redefine what success means, right?
Mm.
And disentangle that from the valuation of institutions. How do you shape your own notions of success? What does that look like for you and the work you want to do? Those of us who are in the academy know that nobody gets into this profession because of money, because there's not any money in this profession. You get into academia because you have some sort of burning desire to do some good,
Yeah.
right? And that good comes from the kind of work and the research and the knowledge and the questions that are burning in you. And so I joke that the academics have to be a little bit obsessive because you really do have to follow for 10 years a question.
Yeah.
And so that requires a lot of patience with yourself,
Hmm.
patience with the work that you're trying to do,
Hmm.
patience with failure, and understanding that failure isn't always a um, valuation of your worth,
Yeah.
but so many other factors come into rejections and whatnot.
Yeah.
um, I come to the work that I do, and particularly to this little book that I love so much because there's a lot of me in it, with a lot of sincerity, and a lot of vulnerability, which people tend to to see as brave, but in
Yeah.
reality, it's being really vulnerable. What I
Yeah.
am in the book, and so I'm just asking the readers to return the favor. Right, I'm
Yeah.
opening my heart, so I'm asking readers to read this with also an open heart.
Yeah.
um, the understanding that I'm entrusting you with a really important part of me, because I truly believe that the only way that we can make it together is
Yeah.
by sharing our knowledge and our resources. There is so much secrecy in the academy,
Yeah.
so much more than any other profession. Nobody knows how anyone gets
No one.
published,
No one.
how processes, right? All of these
No
processes
one.
are incredibly secret.
Yeah.
Every review that of your work is, it's peer review, is it's anonymous.
Yeah.
And while at the same time, all of these anonymous and secret processes have so much power over your success and
Yeah.
your career. And I think the only, and we know from the statistics that you read at the beginning of the interview, we know that something is not right for a lot of us,
For
right?
sure.
Something in the system is not working.
Yeah.
So it's time that we stop protecting a system that A, was not created for people that look like you and me,
Yeah.
and B, is now benefiting our students. So we
No.
have to find an alternative. And for me, an alternative is I'm going to sing. I'm going to share what I know. I've been doing that with my graduate students for a long time. I'm going to share everything I know, and I'm not going to side with the institution in the project of exclusion.
I thank you so much for starting that conversation. You know, what you've shared is that the conversation has been going on in your classrooms for years. But thank you for going public with the conversation, because it's almost given us permission to speak on it, to speak on it.
Mm.
And that's what and that's why this book is going to stay with me. And everyone I know, as soon as they start with a story, I'm going to be like, wait, I have a book. I have a book that will take you to the promised land. It's going to make sense. Read the book. It's the ultimate syllabus on how to succeed in the academy, but how to stay the course. What you've given us is permission to stay the course. So thank you on behalf of the people who haven't read it yet, but the people who will read it now. You begin with your hair. You talk about your hair, my hair, all of our hair. I've always tried to tame my own hair. Why so personal? Why? Tell us about what it means to sort of just go public with the hair.
You know, we've been hearing from Black feminists for a long time the personal is political, right? We, I cannot separate my struggles. I cannot separate my traumas. One of the things that was really, in many ways, shocking to me when I went through what I went through at Harvard was the way my body remembered,
Ah,
the way in which I thought I was fine until I wasn't,
yeah.
and how much similar that experience was to other traumas I lived in my life.
Mm,
And so it's personal. And so for me, one of the ways, and I wanted the book to speak about the challenges of being a woman of color in academia, but I also wanted it to translate to other fields, because I have friends that work in finance, or who are lawyers, and who are nodding when I'm sharing these stories and saying, "Wait for it, I have another one for you."
yeah.
And so one of the ways in which we can connect is by sharing stories about childhood, by sharing stories about upbringing, by grounding our experiences in our lives. And so when I was thinking about how to start the book, how to share where I am right now, I I was asking, or I guess I was asked, how do you how do you become such a rebellious person? Like where did that come from?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I began to kind of think back, and I talked to my mom for a little while and asked her about her memories of me. I remember being often in trouble, quote unquote.
Mhm.
Not being perceived as not well behaved, which is
Yeah.
just a very gendered way of saying, I was
Yeah.
stepping out of line as a girl in a
Yeah.
in a very traditional Dominican family where I was supposed to serve men. And so I began to think about all of those moments and where did this all begin for me? And
Yeah.
and so that's one of my earliest memories of rebellion, just kind of
Mm.
refusing to have my hair straightened, refusing to do the kinds of things that I was supposed to do to tame myself
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
girl and eventually as a woman.
Yeah. 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 I love it. How do we build, as you describe, these communities of rebellion? The book is supporting a movement. What do you think is the practice you are encouraging us to engage in?
What I'm hoping that people do with this book is to think about community as an action, community
Mm,
as a verb. We talk often and we hear it. I honestly hear this phrase almost daily. I can't find community, or I
mm,
found community.
yeah.
And sometimes you are that lucky. Sometimes you're that fortunate that you arrive in a place and there's a community, a welcoming community. That certainly happened to me at times. And
Yeah.
that community holds you and welcomes you in. And you had to do nothing but arrive, right? And
Yeah.
how great, how lucky, how wonderful.
Yeah.
Treasure that if you find it. But for the majority of us, we have to make it, we have to build it, we have to create it.
Yeah.
And so I'm inviting with this book people to build community, to make
Mm,
community a praxis, and
yeah.
to do that by accompanying one another in our path. And
Mm,
that can look like so many different things in your lives, right? It really does depend on the space that you inhabit. But what I can assure you is that anywhere you are, you can absolutely build community, and it's an opportunity to to build that which you didn't have, right?
yeah.
Building community is a lot of work, but it's also incredibly joyful and satisfactory in the sense that you get to decide what that looks like for you. For some of us, we come from amazing families that we're so close to. For some of us, we come from families that are violent and we want nothing to do with them. So how do
Yeah.
we do? How do we come? How do we sustain and love ourselves and create spaces that are loving to us when we have not been loved? And I think that part of that is it's really about acting, about building. And
Yeah.
that could be as simple as breaking bread together once a
Yeah.
week,
Yeah.
and as complicated as, burning some stuff down.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are multiple levels of community, but the essence is the same. We have to make it, we have to build it, we have to act in radical hope to make it
Yeah.
possible.
Now, I got to tell you, what I hear is a podcast, Professor. Your Community as Rebellion podcast. I'm going to put it out there and see what you do with that. I've got 2 minutes left, but what are some of the boycotting practices we as students, faculty, administrators can employ on campus, especially in these elite spaces? What works?
Um, don't serve on diversity and inclusion committees. That is, I'm going to preach
Ah,
that until until the day I
tell us
die.
why. Tell us why.
So we have been hearing diversity and inclusion since 1964,
Right.
right? And we have not seen any structural changes. Inclusion is exactly what it sounds. It sounds it's additive. There's something
Mm,
that's there,
yeah.
and I'm going to add someone to it. I
Yeah.
don't know about you all, but I don't want to be included. I want to create and I want to be centered.
Yeah.
I want the work that I do, I want the communities that I come from to be the center, not just the addition. When
Mm,
you are included, there'll be one, two, if you're lucky, three of you.
yeah.
It's impossible to make the changes that we want to make if we're
Yeah.
only there to add color,
Yeah.
to add legitimacy to a
Yeah.
project that calls itself as inclusive, but it's really a project of exclusion.
Yeah.
So boycott those processes. If you find yourself in a situation in which you are the only one of, and fill in the blank, the only
Yeah.
Indian American, the only Asian American, the only Black, um, leverage that. If you're unable to say no for whatever reason, which sometimes happens, leverage that. Make sure that you are properly compensated, that your work is acknowledged, and that you use that space to enact changes. If you're in a
Mm,
hiring committee, make sure you hire another person of color. Make sure that you use those spaces for what matters to you and to your students
yeah.
and your community.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as you're saying that, I'm also, I'm listening and I'm hearing and I'm wondering about the challenges of the diversity and inclusion initiatives, especially in the academy. And sort of, I mean, it's almost a disempowering space because it's hard to imagine that one individual is going to change a 200-year trajectory of an institution, right? So that's to that end, I agree with you that there are limits to the extent to which you can make impactful change over time, especially if you're dealing with these 300-year institutions that sort of, the rule book's been written, and it's not going to change. Can we talk a little bit in closing about advocacy and activism within the academy? How do we do this? Um, what does it look like? Is it more of community of rebellion? Is it more of what you're sort of framing as creating these communities of rebellion? Tell us a little bit about that.
So that kind of work, activism in the academy, is very challenging, in part because academia teaches us to be individuals, to look
Mm,
out for ourselves, right, and to reward individual work. And so it makes it very challenging to be trusting, to be sharing, to be open.
yeah.
Um, so for me, one of the things that I remind myself is that the power of the classroom as a
Mm,
space for freedom making. When you are a professor, whether you're on a tenure track or an adjunct, the one space that you really have control over is your classroom. That
yeah.
is where you can do. That is where you can create your communities of rebellion. And that means thinking about the syllabus intentionally. That also means naming your subject position, so that your students can trust you, and
Yeah.
creating spaces that are safe for
Mm,
students, especially for
mm,
the most vulnerable students in your community, right? Queer students, students of color, first gen students, students with disability. How do you do that in your classroom so that everyone feels safe?
yeah.
And so we tend to think about revolution, we tend to think about activism in this sort of very large terms, and we all want sort of great plans. We want to change the trajectory of 200 years, right? We want to change the trajectory of our government. We want to change the awful things that are happening in the world. And when we can't, we it very often feel defeated. And I see a lot of amazing people who had the best intentions that eventually crossed their arms and decided to do nothing because, well, nothing changed. That's
Yeah.
not true. A lot can change in just one semester in your classroom. And if I didn't truly believe that education could be transformative, I would be doing something else with my life. I have seen it over the years. I have seen the kinds of changes that can happen when you create a classroom in which students feel safe. So, if nothing else, do that as teachers. Make sure that the space that you inhabit in the classroom is a space of freedom making for your students.
Professor Garcia-Peña, author of Community for Rebellion. Sorry. Professor Garcia-Peña, author of Community as Rebellion. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.